Dr. James Butrinsky, I think well known to many of you, will continue the discussion of oncology targeting in GIST. And David had discussed targeting KIT, the big engine itself for PDGFRA, and James is going to focus more on those things that are triggered by KIT. We call them downstream targets, pathways that are downstream, that may be very useful adjunct targets, both in patients who are still sensitive to drugs like Gleevec and especially perhaps patients who are becoming resistant to such drugs. So James has a major background of contribution to the clinical studies and understanding the biology of GIST, but likewise to a number of other sarcomas. So it's terrific to have you updating us.
Jonathan, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm going to essentially talk about three topics. One, I'm going to go through just a primer on clinical trials because I think that'll be helpful for some of the subsequent talks. Some of you may participate in trials, some of you may not. Maybe this will open your eyes to aspects of clinical trial participation, which we strongly encourage if that's the right approach for you. I'm going to carry on the torch that Dr. D'Adamo had started, talking about therapies for GIST. I'm going to focus on two therapies, sorafenib and regorafenib. These are not FDA-approved treatments for GIST and other cancers. I'll talk about the clinical aspects. I know later in the discussion there'll be more basic science about what these are actually targeting. I know Dr. D'Adamo covered a little of that. And I'm also going to talk about what clinical trials are available here at the Dana-Farber Harvard Cancer Center in GIST. So in terms of clinical trials, I just wanted to go back and talk about some very basic aspects of clinical trials. Clinical trials are essentially research involving humans, people. There are a variety of different types of clinical trials, from therapeutic trials, which are most of the trials that we do here using a specific approved drug or an experimental medication, a study drug, preventative trials that you hear with vitamin B or E or D, prevent lung cancer. Those are obviously very big trials. Quality of life trials, whether the medications how they affect you. Some clinical trials have several aspects involved in their design. Why are we doing clinical trials? We ultimately would love to find a cure for a specific situation, or if we can't find a specific cure, maybe we can find a treatment that's more tolerable. That drives us. When does one do a clinical trial? At really any point of the disease process, we're always thinking of ways to improve on the outcome that we have currently. So that's a discussion one has with their clinician. There are 4 phases of clinical trials. That's how they're often divided. Phase 1 clinical trials, the objective of that clinical trial is to find the right dose for that particular study medication. These are typical trials where Dr. Fletcher and his colleagues in the lab have a new medication that looks promising in the Petri dish. It looks promising in an animal model that has this cancer attached to its leg. We're curing cancer in a mouse, so to speak. And we would like to bring that to try that in people. So there's a cooperation between pharmaceutical companies often or academic institutions that can manufacture a drug, the clinicians who say, wow, this looks like it might be helpful, let's give it a go. So we have first in human trials. That's a phase 1 trial. We're really trying to find the right dose. We have a way to do that. In our hearts, we want the drug to be a home run. We're always hoping to find the home run. Gleevec was in a phase 1 situation. That was clearly a home run. Sunitinib was in a phase 1 situation. Experimental medication is a home run, so we're hoping to find more home runs. But to find these home runs, there are many medications that go by the wayside because we attempt to try and they don't seem to be as successful. When we find the right dose after a phase 1 trial is completed, that's really the main objective, even though we do monitor to see if the tumor shrinks with these medications. Once we find the right dose, we then take that medication to what's called a phase 2 trial. Phase 2 clinical trial in regorafenib we're going to talk about in a moment. We have the effective dose. We have a subtype or cohort of people who have a like situation. They all have GIST tumors. They all have a specific type of non-GIST tumor. And we try to see how effective that medication is. Usually that's 30 to 80 people who participate. And we end up with a percentage of how likely it either shrinks the tumor or how likely people stay on the medication. The particular endpoints are different for many phase 2 trials, but the goal is to find out how effective it is. Once we establish a medication is effective, we then say, let's compare the new kid on the block to the old standard. Let's compare regorafenib to Gleevec. Let's compare sorafenib to Gleevec as an example. Let's compare this new medication to placebo. These are big decisions that are made with cooperation with the FDA, with the investigators, but basically a phase 3 trial is usually a comparative trial, which often is what is taken to the FDA here or the agencies in Europe to say, this is the data we have, it looks like it's better than what's available, can we get an approval for that, which then allows it to be prescribed with that specific, be prescribed and hopefully covered by insurers. Phase 4 clinical trials are called post-marketing trials. That's often where we continue to accumulate information about these medications. There's still information being learned about Gleevec, other side effects that may happen for some of the people that have been on it for 10 years, 15 years, whether they have GIST, whether they have chronic myeloid leukemia. So those add to the database. So that's a brief primer on the 4 phases of clinical trials. Another aspect of clinical trials is actually the clinical trial protocol. This is a time where the basic scientists, the clinicians, interested parties sit down and say, we think this is going to be a drug that we really like to test in people, or we need to design this phase 3 trial, whether it's a therapeutic trial, whether it's a trial that Dr. Rout talked about using radiation therapy and surgery versus surgery alone, and put it in a document, 50-page, 100-page document that's a lot of it's boilerplate, what's the benefit, what are the risks, who pays for this, but that's the blueprint of the trial that if you participate in trials, you'll hear us often talk about, well, the protocol tells us that we need to do this, or you need to be here once a week because that's what we thought would be the best way to manage this particular trial. The clinical trial protocol journey is essentially first stop. Once we have this document, it's reviewed by a scientist. Scientists look at this and say, is there scientific merit to this? If it passes that hurdle, it then goes on to what's called an institutional review board or an ethics board. It's made up of lay people, lawyers, physicians, interested parties, who then look at this document and say, yeah, this looks like the benefit will outweigh the risks. We think it's okay to take and use in people because many of these are experimental medications and we have to make those decisions. Probably the most important aspect of this is the informed consent process or informed consent discussion. That's when the potential participant, the patient, the possible participant on this trial discusses, is this right for them in their particular situation with their clinician, with their treating team. The treating team often is a research nurse, is often the clinician, maybe a nurse practitioner, maybe a nurse in the clinic, where we do as best as we can to go through the risks, the benefits of that trial, answer all the questions that we possibly can, and at the end of that session, we hope that the future participant is very well informed. They would actually sign on a dotted line that doesn't obligate them to anything. It means they understand it's voluntary to participate in a research trial. They understand that they can decide to back out of the trial at any point. And it just means that we've answered their questions. And that's the document we use to then do the appropriate research test to find out if somebody's eligible for a clinical trial. And if they're eligible, then we move forward. Benefits of participation. There are many benefits to participate in clinical trials. One simple one is it increases your options. Many of these drugs are not available in any other venue. These are not things that can be prescribed. So we look at them as other available options, and if it's right for you, that it ultimately increases options for treatments that are not otherwise available. Risk of participation. We all hope that this particular study medication or something that looks like it has worked in other people is going to work in that individual person, but it doesn't always work like that. Often, phase 1 trials, many of the trials that we have as phase 1s ultimately were not carried on to phase 2 trials because they weren't very effective. But there are ones that are. So the fact that the medication or the experimental medication will not work is something that needs to be contemplated. The fact that there may be side effects that are known that the person may have, they may have all the side effects and none of the benefits. There may be side effects we don't know about. If this is a first-in-human trial, we're eagerly monitoring for any side effect that we didn't anticipate from its use in a mouse or a chimpanzee or whatnot. Barriers to participation. This was kind of partly commented on by Tanya. There's always logistics when we have clinical trials. For instance, many phase 1 clinical trials may require you to come to the Dana-Farber once a week. So if you're from California and you want to participate in the clinical trial that we only have here, that's a decision you have to make. Can I get to the Dana-Farber once a week? Housing. So very practical issues. So logistics can sometimes prevent people from deciding to participate in a clinical trial. We bend over backwards with our social workers, with our housing specialists to try to offer options for people so they don't have to be independently wealthy to participate in a clinical trial just because the housing here might be more expensive if they need to spend multiple days here. Some trials require 8 to 10-hour days consecutively, so there are some challenges. I write the word fear. I could have written guinea pig. This is a common word that some of us hear in the clinic. I don't want to be a guinea pig. I'm not really excited about doing that. Isn't this what this is about? I would strongly disagree. We think it's a very informed consent process. So, but fear is a potential hurdle amongst others. With that background, I'm just going to now switch focus to sort of the second part of the talk, discussing the two clinical drugs, sorafenib and regorafenib. You're going to see a lot more elegant pictures later, but this, if you can envision a cancer cell, this being a cancer cell, the outside of the cancer cell has a membrane which has proteins in it, and some of these proteins on their own or as a consequence of other factors signal to the inside of the cell and tell it to do things that we don't want it to do. Grow, survive, make new blood vessels to recruit more nutrients, etc. So many of the drugs, imatinib, sunitinib that you've heard about, target proteins like this to stop that process to cause a GIST tumor to shrink, to disappear. So we are looking for drugs that can target processes that will allow beneficial responses. One drug that has met some of these criteria is sorafenib. It is in the family of drugs that has broad activity, meaning it targets many proteins. It is somewhat similar to sunitinib, but different. We find that this can sometimes target some proteins that have been mutated that do not currently benefit or do not currently respond to drugs like imatinib and sunitinib. Sorafenib itself has been approved in renal cell cancer, kidney cancer, and liver cancer, so it is an FDA-approved drug. In people that had kidney cancer, and we do take cues from other types of diseases or cancers, sunitinib doesn't always work in kidney cancer, and when it doesn't work, there are times that sorafenib does work. So with a variety of this emphasis, it's been looked at in GIST. I'm just going to go very briefly over some of the clinical data. There was some benefit in patients who have GIST. This is a slide that gives a little bit more detail of one experience. This was discussed in 2009. For each bar vertically is an individual person with GIST. People that are in yellow here had benefit from sorafenib. This group of people, the tumor stayed roughly the same size. This group of people, there was growth of the tumor. We typically look at this line over as a group of people that have clinical benefit, meaning they're living with their tumor, it's not growing, or hopefully it's shrinking. So in general, we feel that sorafenib has some benefit. At this moment, there's ongoing, there's further interest in sorafenib, but it has not at this point been FDA approved. But it is a medication that we occasionally use. We call this off-label use of medication in a particular patient setting. Regorafenib is a drug that's similar to sorafenib. It has a fluorine in an area of the molecule sorafenib, so it's distinct from sorafenib. It has a little bit different activity of inhibition, and it seems to have had some benefit in people that have kidney cancer, lung cancer, and colon cancer. In a trial that Dr. Suzanne George, who was a principal investigator of here and was the principal investigator of this multi-institutional trial, phase 2 trial, and as I discussed earlier, this was looking at how effective this medication was. In roughly a month, we were able, with our collaborators, to get about 34 patients. You can look at some of the information. I just want to point out that there was a clinical benefit rate of about 55%, and this, and also to emphasize that there were people who had GIST, who have some subtypes of GIST. This is for the GIST aficionados. Different mutations are things that some people with GIST, we can do specific testing to look at what molecular defect their tumor may have. There was activity that we saw in people that had a variety of different mutations, including wild type GIST. Dr. Janeway will discuss this a little bit more in her subsequent talk. The bottom line was, in this trial, to look at how effective this medication was on its own compared to historical information. We felt that regorafenib met that criteria. To follow up on that, a phase 3 trial, as we mentioned, comparing, in this case, regorafenib to a placebo, was undertaken. A very large trial that was in roughly 85 countries. We were fortunate to be the first site in the USA to open this trial. The trial compared regorafenib, the study medication, to a placebo. People were followed very carefully. When people are on placebos, we take that very seriously. They're followed very carefully. Scans were done at very short intervals, or even shorter intervals if their clinical situation required that. And the upshot of this trial, the data hasn't been reviewed by, or we haven't seen the final data, but there was a recent press release from the company that manufactures regorafenib stating that the trial has met its primary endpoint. Dr. Wagner later will talk about study endpoints, progression-free survival, overall survival. This is very encouraging for us, and we're hoping that after we get a chance to hear about some of this information, which we're going to hear about in about a month at a large clinical meeting for oncologists, ASCO, this hopefully will eventually be reviewed by the FDA, and it would be, it would be our hope that this would be something that would be in our armamentarium, FDA-approved medication for GIST in people that have had imatinib or sunitinib, and that didn't work for them. In the third part of my talk, I just want to focus a little bit about what is happening in our institution and focus on, last year I had this same slide with the exception that in the continuum of people with this specific type of sarcoma GIST that we've been talking about, newly diagnosed patients who have the tumor localized that has been removed. Dr. Raut commented on the 3-year Scandinavian study utilizing this drug called imatinib. There was an ongoing trial last year that now is accrued, and we're analyzing the data utilizing imatinib for 5 years. We don't have a trial available for this subtype of people, but we're eagerly awaiting this information. In patients who have newly diagnosed metastatic GIST, there was a trial comparing imatinib to nilotinib, sort of a different form of imatinib. That trial has recently been closed. The group of people that we see here most often, and probably the more dire need at this point for improved therapies, are people that have had GIST who've gone through imatinib, IM, and sunitinib. We have a variety of clinical trials that are available for this group of people. Pazopanib is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, so another drug that blocks those proteins that live on the cell surface or inhibits their function. This is our current phase 2 trial that is our main trial for people that come to us that are interested in clinical trials and eligible. I will discuss these agents in my next slide. And then there are unfortunately people that have gone through imatinib, sunitinib, sorafenib, pazopanib, And these people are usually the ones we're discussing phase 1 clinical trials, more experimental medications in hope of finding that home run. This gives us a little bit more detail of the slide I just showed. We have a variety of targets that we're interested in. HSP90 is a target you're going to hear a little bit more about later. These are a couple of different drug types that are being used to target this target. As Dr. D'Adamo talked about earlier, we are trying to combine something with imatinib, often kind of on to Tanya's point, to see if we can get some additional traction, so to speak, and additional benefit. PI3 kinase mTOR is sort of a dual drug in one drug. We are looking at an antibody, a larger molecule that targets a protein that's important for some subtype of some patients with GIST, PDGFRA alpha mutant GIST. And there's a new trial that has recently been activated here utilizing a PI3 kinase inhibitor with imatinib. Lastly, we have other abilities for people to participate in clinical research that aren't necessarily therapy trials, as I mentioned. One is at our site, at Mass General, we have databases. We'd love people to participate. This isn't exclusive to people with GIST. It's anybody that comes into our clinic that has a sarcoma. We try to see if they'd allow us to participate, allow their participation in a database that allows us to look at their clinical information, look at samples that have already been obtained, potentially use samples that will be obtained for clinical purposes to understand as much as possible about the specific sarcoma they have. OncoMap and Snapshot are two clinical trials. OncoMap is at the Dana-Farber Brigham and Women's Cancer Center. This site, Snapshot, is currently used at Massachusetts General Hospital. These are looking at specific genes and specific mutations to try to understand if there's any relevant information that might be useful for future therapy. This usually just requires samples from tumors that have already been removed. So we're very excited about these two clinical trials that are bringing us closer to personalized medicine, to understand the cancer signature for us to better possibly target it with therapies. Lastly, some of you may participate in Project FLAG, Families Learning About GIST. I can talk to you about this more later if this interests you, but this is a big initiative at most of the large GIST centers in this country, and I encourage you to ask me about this offline. Lastly, one thing that Dr. Rout had brought up earlier and the questions from the audience, we see GIST and non-GIST sarcomas that will be discussed later. This is a very rare subtype of tumors. We try to collaborate as much as possible. This is not even an exhaustive list. We have medical oncologists, radiation oncologists, surgical oncologists that we often bring into most of our consultations because it really does take a village to take care of somebody that has GIST or non-GIST sarcomas. We also utilize our radiologists and their collaboration, our pathologists. This is not even an exhaustive list. Katie Janeway and Carlos Rodriguez Galindo, who are medical oncologists at the Jimmy Fund. We work closely with our colleagues across town as well as our colleagues at Beth Israel. We have phase 1 trials that are open at all institutions. Sometimes we may favor some than others, but it really does take a village to care for people with GIST and non-GIST sarcomas. And lastly, I'd just like to take a moment to thank the people in the audience who are patients, their caregivers. GIST Cancer Research Fund has really been an important source of funding for our site as well as other sites. There's also people that have helped with funding that are named and unnamed. I'd also like to thank the Kapilofs, who I know are here in the audience. They've offered funding through auctions that are done locally in Atlanta. So we can't thank you enough. And lastly, my colleagues and the Fletcher Lab. I'm happy to answer any questions.